evening, everyone. My name is Elizabeth, the Education Coordinator for Marlene's Market and Deli. Tonight's special guest that we have with us is Dr. Deanna Minich. She is a certified nutritional specialist, certified functional medicine practitioner, a nutrition scientist, international lecturer, teacher, and author with over 20 years of experience in the academics of nutrition and in the food and dietary supplement industries. So we are always so honored to work with her and for her to share her expertise tonight on a very important topic, top foods for neuroprotection. Thank you so much, Dr. Deanna Minich.
All right. Well, thank you, Elizabeth. And thank you to everybody who's here live. I see some familiar faces, which is always great. So fabulous. All right. I do have a lot of information. I actually had to go through the slides right before this because I'm like, wow, this is too much for an hour. This is jam-packed. So I am going to move through this in the best way I can. Don't get too concerned if I'm not going through everything on the slides. I really just want to give you some general takeaways about top foods for neural protection. How do you help to nourish, heal, and optimize your brain through food? And there are so many different options available. Now, keep in mind that this webinar, this live stream is educational, and I'm not doing any kind of diagnosing or treating. Always check with your healthcare practitioner. This is really important because everybody has personalized needs. So if you hear anything within this recording or live stream, just make sure that you check in with your healthcare practitioner to see if it would fit you. Okay, so what are we going to do tonight? We're going to talk about at least 10 neuroprotective nutrients in foods. I will touch on ways to optimize those foods in the daily diet for their greatest impact. And I'm a huge believer and implementer of all things creativity. So let's also talk about creative strategies and how to include these foods in the diet, because at the end of the day, it's good to have the information, but if you don't have the application, it doesn't take hold. Okay, so since we are talking about the brain and the nervous system, we first need to talk about root causes. What leads the brain to dysfunction and imbalance? And if we can understand the root causes, then we can figure out what type of nutrients could fit in and help to heal that root cause. It's like a tree. What are the roots? So that we have the proper soil, we get that nourishment to the roots in order to have a healthy trunk, healthy leaves of that tree in a metaphorical sense. So when I think of brain dysfunction, I think of these 4 different aspects of our physiology. I think of inflammation, which we know is the hallmark or the foundational aspect of aging and different chronic diseases. I think of oxidative stress, which is when we have too much free radical activity, and those free radicals, which are normally produced from metabolism, aren't in check. They're not in balance. So it's almost like they make the body go rancid, so to speak. The gut microbiome, so much here. We're going to talk about the gut tonight. In fact, the gut microbiome is so vast that it's even been considered its own organ. It's just amazing to think that we have more microorganisms in our gut than we do have cells of our own body. So the impact of the gut on the brain is something that has been acknowledged for some time in science and even in clinical medicine. So we'll talk about that. And then, of course, my background is in nutritional medicine. So looking at nutrient imbalances and how important those would be for the brain. So the way that I'm going to tour you through is to touch on each of these as we go. So when I think of inflammation, I start to think of anti-inflammatory foods, and this fits more than just the brain. This could help the skin, the heart, so many different aspects of health. So there's a lot of cross-purposing because the body is a web. It is an interwoven system. For oxidative stress, we want to be thinking about foods that are high in antioxidant potential. In fact, I just made a Facebook post not too long ago talking about some research in which it was found that red, blue, and purple foods were highest in oxygen radical absorbance capacity. So looking at ORAC. Now, it's not to say that we should only have those colors. I do believe that we need the whole rainbow, but there are certain colors of food that could have certain concentrations. So they're just a little bit more packed. For the gut microbiome, tonight we're going to talk about fiber and polyphenols. If you don't know that polyphenols word, you're going to hear more about it, I'm sure, over the next couple of years. And then for the nutrient imbalances, talking about the whole spectrum of different nutrients and establishing that foundation. And this is where working with a practitioner is really important to understand where you stack up relative to a lot of the different nutrients, whether it's minerals, vitamins, macronutrients, and even some of the phytonutrients. So first, we look at the science of nutrition, which can be seen through the lens of the gut. If we look to the far left here, this is an image of reflecting on the gut, how we take in food, and we have that gut lumen where a lot of that food is coming through the tube of our being, going from mouth to anus. So we take those foods in. We have that interaction at the level of the gut, which can then determine our systemic response. For example, inflammation, and eventually get into the blood-brain barrier. That's what BBB is here. So that's why often we say that what happens in the gut translates to the brain, because the gut barrier is pretty similar to the very selective blood-brain barrier. And if we can control what happens at the level of the gut and what gets in, then we can change ultimately what perhaps the blood-brain barrier sees. So the whole science of nutrition is so key for everything as it relates to all systems, and especially the brain. In fact, we hear a lot about leaky gut and how we can see this porosity or permeability of the gut. And what we can also see is how the leaky gut can also beget what we might call leaky brain. So this was a study published in 2019 looking at the connection between the gut microbiota and psychiatric mood disorders. And essentially what these authors were talking about is how in depressed patients, there is also evidence of increased blood-brain barrier permeability. And through a compromised BBB, you see these cytokines and chemokines that infiltrate the central nervous system, stimulating microglia and astrocyte activation. So causing this unhealthy excitation in the brain. Well, if you were just to be with me in an elevator and I had 30 seconds just to say what I think would be most important for you to eat in the way of keeping a healthy brain, reducing that excitation, reducing the inflammation, this would be my short list. Looking to see that you have a low glycemic index way of eating, meaning that we're not changing insulin response in unhealthy ways. This is a real big deal. In fact, there was just a paper that came out looking at amyloid beta production. Now we know that amyloid beta aggregation, so when it clusters in the brain in an unhealthy way, this is one of the hallmarks of dementia. Specifically, we look at Alzheimer's disease. And one of the things that helps with the metabolism of amyloid is insulin. There's a very close dynamic there. So making sure that we have a low glycemic index way of eating, low glycemic load, that we're constantly paying attention to glucose, insulin, and cortisol. Second would be high in phytochemicals, which I'm going to talk about. I have a love of all things phytochemicals. Plants are amazing in the way of what they provide, in the way of fiber, vitamins, and thousands of different compounds that I think we're only starting to discover. I think that there's so much more there. A dietary pattern that's high in anti-inflammatory fats. I'm going to talk about omega-3s tonight. And then low in advanced glycation end products. Well, what does that mean? That means that we need to be very attentive to how we cook food, making sure that we're not producing a lot of these complexes, which can be very damaging and also inflammatory. So when we grill and fry and we start to apply the high heat, we can get complexes that form, and then those go on to promote inflammation. So there's a lot here as it relates to looking at high glycemic carbohydrates and looking at amyloid load. This is an older study from 2017 looking at people who were cognitively healthy, but found that they had poorer cognitive performance with greater dietary sugar intake. So this is even in people who have healthy brains, that we can have this acute influence of changing our cognitive performance based on even sugar intake. So looking at a high glycemic load diet, sugar intake, and carbohydrate intake, each of those were associated with high amyloid burden. So amyloid is already in our bodies. This is just a protein, but again, when it gets to the point of excess, when it's coupled with inflammation and insulin resistance, it sets the match. It lights that match to further inflammation in the brain and changes. All right, so when I think of nutrition and different nutrients and foods for moods, I do want to just give you the high level here of some of the research that has been done. If we look at Dr. Drew Ramsey's work, and Dr. Ramsey is, in fact, I'm going to see him next week at the American Nutrition Association conference. He's done a lot of great work looking at mood and food, looking at which foods are antidepressant based on their nutrient intake. And you can see his paper at the bottom here, and Dr. LaChance as well. This is a list of 12 nutrients that seem to be even, I would say, a little bit more implicated in better mood. And so when we talk about mood here specifically, at least in this article, it was focusing on depression. So looking at folate and iron, omega-3s, magnesium. It's so hard to say that there's just one thing we need. We potentially need multiple things. And again, working with a practitioner to assess what you might be lacking. If we look a little bit further into their work and how they created an algorithm of the different nutrients, and then looking at the different foods that contain those nutrients, this was their list of greatest to least in terms of the nutrients that they contain. So vegetables, far and away, were at the top, followed by, and this might surprise some of you, organ meats, fruits, seafood, legumes, meats, grains, nuts and seeds, and dairy. So if we were just to look at the plant food section, what we see is that a lot of the foods that were listed, and again, it's in the order of what was highest with respect to the algorithm of different nutrients, we see that there's a lot of green here, a lot of folate concentration, and watercress is at the tippy top here, really important to help with mood. Spinach, turnip, or beet greens, lettuces, Swiss chard, etc. And then as far as animal foods, oysters were very high. I think that was because of the zinc content. Organ meats, poultry giblets, clams, mussels, octopus, crab. So it just kind of depends on if you eat these foods. And if you follow Dr. Terry Wahls, she is a huge advocate of things like organ meats. So Dr. Wahls has the Wahls protocol and has looked at the composite of different high sulfur containing vegetables and leafy greens, and also looking at some of the high protein foods. Okay, so the macronutrients. So that just kind of sets the stage at a larger level, looking mechanistically, looking from a root cause perspective, and then looking at some of the patterns of nutrients and how things come together. But now I'm going to start to break it down a little bit more. So if we just think about macronutrients, in other words, protein, carbohydrate, and fat, the things that most people, when they think nutrition, is where their mind goes. We are going to talk about essential fatty acids. Protein is so key. In fact, I have come to think even more about protein for so many different things. And the reason why is because quality protein coincides with metabolic detoxification pathways, with certain enzymes and certain conjugates for getting toxins out of the body. And quality protein is also very much responsible for fortifying muscle health. And muscle health is extremely important And even more important, in an aging population, it helps to keep up our insulin sensitivity. And remember what I mentioned about insulin and its connection to amyloid. So that's why having protein at every meal is something that I think is essential. It's very important. And I do think, we need to really evaluate what we need at a personalized level. There was an article that just came out in PubMed where they were questioning the current recommended daily intake of protein and whether or not it was adequate. There are so many variables that will determine whether or not we have adequate protein. Are we physically active? Do we have inflammation where we have constant muscle breakdown? So a lot of different factors there, but I'm a huge advocate of quality protein as much as I am to the prebiotic fibers. And we're going to talk separately about those. So let's dive into omega-3 fatty acids. This is what my doctoral work was on, is looking at the absorption and metabolism of these amazing fats. If you think of the brain is mostly fat. We literally have a fat head. We have a lot of lipid in our brain. And so we want the right kinds of fats. So I often think of, when we start with an organ, looking at its structure. What is its structure comprised of? Well, it's lipid rich. It's got a lot of omega-3 fats is what we would like to see, but also in balance with the omega-6 fats. There are a number of studies indicating that having more omega-3 fats is associated with better cognitive markers. So there's an easy test. I know many of you are practitioners on the line. Good to have you here. There's an easy test people can do with a practitioner to see whether or not they have adequate omega-3 levels. So the omega-3 index, it's very easy, it's very inexpensive, and it will cue you in as to how much you need to supplement, if at all. I remember some years ago, I even tested my own levels and I was supplementing on a daily basis and my levels were a bit too high. So I needed to adjust my supplementation. And I've seen other people clinically where they're taking omega-3s consistently, but yet their levels are low. So it's not easy and good enough just to say like, okay, I'm taking a supplement every day. I think I'm good. Your body may be using it up more. It may not be absorbing it. There are so many different factors with omega-3s. And of course, you do want to look at the balance with other fats like the omega-6s. Now, what is unique about omega-3 fats in some way is that they do work together with fat-soluble nutrients. And we're going to talk tonight about carotenoids and their role in brain health, as well as I'm not going to get into vitamin E tonight to any great length, but there are other fat-soluble nutrients that do deposit into the brain and seem to be instrumental either structurally or functionally for cognitive health. Omega-3s are also, they're important for so many things. If you think of it, our cells are made of fats. And so every cell of the body is going to have some connection to omega-3s. So what we see, and I've just seen this even lately, there was an article looking at how having omega-3 fats and having enough of them can be very important for women going through the menopause transition and with aging. So looking at emotional aspects, cognitive health. So there can be certain times of our lives that we may need a little bit more. Well, I'm not going to tour you through. This is just so that you can see that there is a fatty acid family tree, as I like to call it. It's divided up into saturated fat, unsaturated fat, and under the unsaturated fat is where you find, if you look all the way down at the bottom here, the omega-3s. And so having something like a fish oil supplement will have primarily the EPA and DHA. And if you are vegan and you don't do the fish oil, then you would be doing an algal oil, which would contain typically the DHA and not so much of the EPA. And or you could do the flaxseed oil or some kind of seed or nut oil that would be enriched in ALA, alpha-linolenic acid, which depending on how well your body can convert to the longer chains, that would be something to include. So the fatty acids, we could do a whole seminar just on fatty acids. How do you measure them? What are the food sources? But I think for our purposes right now, really just honing in on those omega-3s. And it's, as I mentioned, it's less about deficiency and more about the imbalance. It's really important to note that, yes, it's important to have the right amount of omega-3s, especially in the brain, but because we are eating, for the most part, a seed oil based diet. This is just mainstream. And again, I know that many of you on this live stream right now are very savvy. So you know about this, so you're more in tune. But if you're not, you can always go to a practitioner who can measure your omega-3s, your omega-6s, calculate the ratio, and see where you net out. Because most of our modern diets are going to be tending a bit more towards omega-6. And omega-6s aren't bad. It's just about the balance of the omega-3 and the omega-6, because when it's not in balance, it can be more inflammatory. So in general, there are certain ratios that are advised as being healthy or better than others, but typically, some people say 1-to-1, but I would say that most literature would suggest something in the order of like 2-to-5-to-1. So having that ratio of omega-6 to omega-3. So we have this this looks like a lot of text here. Don't get too concerned. I just wanted to have a thumbnail of some of and I have this for some of the other nutrients as well. So some of the functions, why omega-3 is for the brain, because of their role in inflammation. They're an energy source, and they're also an important part of structure. They're very fluid. And so that enables better transport of things like neurotransmitters and even things like hormones. And so from just a structural aspect, that can change the function. Food sources, as I mentioned, we can, if we're taking a supplement, we can have a fish oil, flaxseed oil, algal oil, but even through the diet, there can be so many different things if we're taking in a diverse array of them. And I'm all about diversity. I do think that bringing in a lot of different foods gives us better nutrient status. Who would be prone to not having enough omega-3s? Be people that don't have enough of these fats. Maybe they're on a low fat diet, or they have increased need. Sometimes vegans and vegetarians, it just depends on the nature and the pattern of how they're eating. It might be imbalanced, or it could be perfectly in balance. Micronutrient deficiency, because we need micronutrients, we need vitamins and minerals in order to convert some of the shorter omega-3s into the longer chain. So that's important. People with digestive disorders. And this is during my PhD research, I was looking at children with cystic fibrosis and whether or not they could take up essential fatty acids. So they have challenges because they don't have enough of the pancreatic enzymes to break apart those fats. So again, just important to look at the broader scope with a practitioner who can guide you through. Sometimes we can even just look at physical symptoms like dry skin, hair, eyes. Are we fatigued? Cognitive impairment, mood issues, poor wound healing, frequent infections, inflammation, allergic reactions. Now, some of these things are also because of other aspects, but it can belong to the composite of looking at omega-3s. So I have some assessment here, and then looking at the Institute of Medicine, what do they recommend? And again, these are just general principles. This needs to be personalized to the individual. So just to reinstate what I had on the slide before, some sources of omega-3s. And, I get the question all the time about methyl mercury in fish and what is my take on that? And this is where one of the protective aspects of diversity is that we don't have the same influx of different nutrients and different toxins coming in. So it's not that we avoid salmon, it's that we make better choices and that we diversify. So having wild caught salmon, I even like to shop from different grocery stores with different types, of course, Marlene's, but I do diversify my grocery selection so that I'm getting different parts of the world coming in. And this is where, I'm just coming off of some international travel, just being exposed to different sources of food. Sometimes I think we get in the rut of allergy and intolerance to food because we're doing the same thing over and over. So I'm sure you've heard this before. When people go to Europe or different countries, they can withstand much more in the way of what they're eating. And I think in part it might be because of the different sources, different nutrients, different levels of toxins in foods. It could also be related to pesticide exposure. But if we can diversify the different food sources of omega-3s, I think then we get just a whole array of different other nutrients that come along for the ride. All right, fiber. Who isn't in love with fiber? Fiber has made a comeback, and it's so important to look at fiber within the context of brain health. The reason why is because fiber can help with reducing blood sugar, can help with insulin release. So again, the white, brown, yellow types of starches are high in glycemic load. That leads to inflammation. I mean, if there was just one thing that I would advocate to most people, it would be this. It would be really try to get your sugar content down. This is not good for the brain. It's not good for any part of the body. Having whole food, low glycemic carbohydrates in a diverse array can be essential for building the gut and helping blood sugar. And one of the things, again, I like to apply is this whole thing about rotational fibers. I call it rotational fibers. When we have different fibers of different types, they have different configurations. And so they are building our gut microbiome and changing the population in different ways. So it's not just have this supplemental fiber and have it every day, but change up and have a variety of different kinds of fibers because they all have different properties. They can bind differently and they can change the population in the gut differentially. So in general, I think that even these intakes of fiber are pretty modest, but the recommended intakes are 25 grams for women and 38 grams for men. And this is typically based on overall calorie intake, around 2,000 calories. And most people fall short of that amount. So in general, again, no added sugars or high glycemic processed foods. Bring in those fibers, aim for that 30 grams per day. And it's, there are so many different types of fiber sources to be getting. So just to strategically have at certain points of the day, certain ones that are higher, I think is worthwhile. Fermented foods are also great because they have prebiotic and probiotic content. So what I try to do pretty much every morning, I rotate even among different fermented foods. I have usually about 2 or 3 that I just take a little bit in the morning to ensure that I'm getting these healthy microorganisms. Now, they're not tolerated by everybody, so I acknowledge that. For some people with high histamine, they're not able to have high amounts of fermented foods, so that they would need to get their fibers from other sources. So this special thing about prebiotic fibers is that they give us these, ultimately, here's the connection with fat. They give us short chain fatty acids, which help with the brain overall. So these short chain fatty acids stimulate the production of a healthy mucus layer in the gut. Now that also can come from other plant-based compounds that aren't fibrous, but in general, we get healthy mucus in the gut, like a good mucus, right? To actually protect and to provide a barrier. These short chain fatty acids and fibers, they help to promote manufacture of antibacterial peptides. They help to keep the gut in its integrity. So those tight junctions rather than leaky gut. They provide energy and overall impact the immune function because most of our immunity is held within our gut, 60 to 70%. And there's even a role for fiber in helping to promote healthy stress response. Why? Because when we have too much cortisol, the stress hormone, this can be deleterious for the gut. It can lead to leaky gut. So we're rebuilding the gut back with fiber. Now, the direct brain connection comes from this BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factor. And what we see is that prebiotic fibers can help with the production of this compound that can stimulate the nerve cell growth. So I think that that's pretty fantastic. I'm not going to tour you through this. This is just showing you graphically what I've already described. So starting from the bottom, you have the fiber. You are interacting with the gut microbiome. You are getting these short chain fatty acids, acetate, propionate, butyrate. This is changing cell signaling effects, which change the immune system, go on to the organs, and ultimately up to the brain, where you are seeing these changes in blood-brain barrier. You're seeing a better profile with all of the different cell types. So again, it's just really beautiful how what we do in the gut does translate into the brain. And this is also showing that. I know it's a little bit biochemical and more convoluted, but if you look at the top, here is an example of a fiber and all the many functions of fiber. And again, short chain fatty acid production, microbiota diversity. And in fact, a lot of the different studies now are showing that richness and diversity of the gut microbiome is very protective. Even today on my personal Facebook page, I posted it was actually a blog from the Institute for Functional Medicine talking about how probiotics can help with heavy metal detoxification. And if you think of heavy metals, things like aluminum, lead, cadmium, methylmercury, these things impact cognition and brain health. So if we can get at the level of the gut microbiome, we can prevent a lot of the systemic changes. So less adhesion of pathogens. We strengthen the mucus layer, which again is a big deal. We want good, healthy mucus there. And we strengthen the cells, the epithelial cells as well with fiber. So fiber hits on a lot of different mechanisms, and it's not even shown here, but of course, helping with blood sugar response. So fiber, and most people think of it as helping with healthy bowels and relieving constipation. All of that's true. Removing toxins, helping with satiety and appetite. But mostly what I'm talking about here as it relates to the brain, we're focusing on the glycemic impact, the gut microbiome modulation. So lots of different choices of different fibers and moving away from the ultra processed way of eating into a bit more plants. And again, I don't subscribe to a dietary dogma. It's really about personalized nutrition. So me saying plants and fiber doesn't mean that you have to be vegan or vegetarian. Just bringing in more plants or even supplemental fibers can be key. All right, now I'm going to talk about water for a second here. And when it comes to brain health, I do think it's really important to mention water, because even small amounts of dehydration can lead to cognitive impairment. So first and foremost, looking at the foundation, talking about, as I was mentioning, fats, looking at carbohydrate, I do want to put water in here. I do think it's a big deal. Having minerals together with water is important, especially for uptake, utilization in the body. I do this every morning. I do what's called sole therapy, where you take super saturated Himalayan salt solution. You take a little bit of that into water. You get minerals with the water. It's really important to hydrate, especially first thing in the morning when we haven't had any liquid, any fluid. And during those early morning hours, if we are dehydrated and we have other issues, it could set the stage for increased risk of things like stroke. So really important to bring in water, especially first thing in the morning, and to hydrate throughout the day. And there are going to be certain groups of people that are more susceptible to changes in dehydration, but be thinking about this as it relates to brain health. I know it's not something that is probably on everybody's mind, but it can change so much. It can allow us to focus better, to concentrate better just by having more water. All right, so let's move into the micronutrients, talking about vitamins and minerals a bit. I love this study from Dr. Carol Greenwood. Um, I met her many years ago. She was at the University of Toronto, and she did some work on type 2 diabetics and looking at what would happen if they added an antioxidant vitamin to a high-fat meal to see what would happen with memory, with cognition. And we know that diabetics, just by nature of their changes with their glycemic response and their insulin, they tend to have higher risk of cognitive impairment. So she did this study with her research group in which they had a control meal. It was a high-fat meal, excuse me, which consisted of a Danish pastry, cheddar cheese, yogurt with added whipped cream for a total of 50 grams of fat. And then she gave them the same meal plus vitamin C and vitamin E. And then the third test was with just water. And after each of these different scenarios, they were given these cognitive tests after the meal at 2 different time points. And what the result was that compared with water, cognitive performance on certain tasks was poorer after the high-fat meal. So there was some impairment, and we would call this metabolic endotoxemia, right? Where there was a change in the gut because of this high-fat flux. And again, it's not to say that we're opposed to fat, but all of this at once, often we think of just the sugar, but the high fat can also lead to these changes in the gut, this production of endotoxin that can ultimately lead to brain changes. Now, what they found that was probably most interesting for all of us here is that the addition of the antioxidant vitamins to that high-fat meal resulted in the same cognitive results as water intake. That's pretty profound. Now, the message I don't want to give is, well, just have that meal, but just take vitamins to override the effects. There was just one particular marker that was being looked at here. We don't know about the changes in other body systems. However, it does show the power of having things like vitamins with a meal to blunt some of the effects of oxidative stress, which can be very damaging and hurt the brain. Another nutrient, if we're thinking of vitamins, vitamin B12 deficiency affects a high percentage of older adults and can be implicated in brain health. So that's something that can be tested fairly easily. It's important for the nervous system, just overall the function, as well as so many other things. Some of you know about methylation. It's involved in that. So what are some food sources? So fish, meat, poultry, eggs, a lot of animal-based products, but you can have supplemental products if you don't eat those products. So even nutritional yeast, and technically the gut microbiome can produce some degree of vitamin B12, although perhaps not enough. So there can be many different risk factors that can tie in, deficiency symptoms, and again, having a workup to see if somebody has low vitamin B12. And there are so many types of B12 that are available in supplemental form. But again, I'm just trying to focus more on food. So the folate cycle, folate again, back to Dr. Ramsey's work, looking at the role of folate in depression and how important folate is. So we see the role of B12 in this folate cycle to activate it, as well as a number of other types of vitamins like vitamin B6, vitamin B2, also methionine, betaine, choline. This is a whole composite, and some of you are pretty familiar with this. There are a number of different nutrients to make this run effectively, and we need this pathway to run well for neurotransmitters, for healthy levels of homocysteine, for healthy detoxification, so many different things. So it does impact brain activity. So if we look at sources again of B12, I have a list here. Again, some of the higher levels of B12 in the diet do come from animal sources. Excuse me, but there are some other ways to be getting B12. All right, vitamin C. Vitamin C, I think, is really important for the brain. In fact, if you look at even the differentiation and development of the neurons and the myelin formation, vitamin C is influential. It plays a role in modulating much of the neurotransmitters. It alters cortisol. It changes the structural integrity through collagen formation. I see so many of these collagen powders on the market, but just having collagen alone as the protein is not really the full picture of how we form collagen. We also need vitamin C, really important. So it's an important cofactor, and even some of the things that come along with foods that are high in vitamin C, like the citrus polyphenols, are also looking, if we look at some of the emerging research, it also looks like they can be very important for the brain. So I like this graphic because it just shows the levels of vitamin C in the different organs. And if you look up at the top, the brain, we see 2 to 10 millimolar. The adrenals tend to be pretty high. But in general, the brain has a high concentration of vitamin C. And this gets back to Abram Hoffer and other people in psychiatry over the years looking at the role of vitamin C in many types of mental disorders like schizophrenia. Vitamin C, I think, is overlooked for brain health. So these are some of the foods that are rich in vitamin C, going according to from top to bottom here. That would be, so acerola cherries would be highest, down to strawberries. And then those citrus polyphenols, I'm going to talk about polyphenols in just a few minutes, but the polyphenols that we find in citrus foods are wonderful for, again, promoting healthy gut activity, and then having a more, I would say, more of a take on inflammatory processes in the body. Excuse me, I have a tickle in my throat. Let me get some tea. I'm drinking some nice herbal tea. I think it's chamomile and a mixture of different things. And even tea, if I think of tea and all of the different phytochemicals in tea and some of the cultures that live the longest in the world, it's just amazing how much tea is had throughout the day, how it punctuates the day. And again, just even thinking about the role of tea in brain health because of those nutrients. All right, so most people are insufficient in minerals, especially things like iron, selenium, and zinc. Our soils are more depleted, and I just think that minerals overall, separate from vitamins, which we talked very briefly about, minerals compete with heavy metals. So if you have low minerals in the body, low essential minerals, there can be a risk of having higher levels of toxins. So what would be some minerals for the brain? Well, there are so many different ones. And again, we just have a short time period together, but magnesium is key. Magnesium is key for the muscles, the nerves, for neurotransmitter release, for helping with glucose metabolism. So if we're talking about making sure that we keep our blood sugar balanced, we do want to be thinking of magnesium. Type 2 diabetics tend to be low in magnesium. Most people tend to be low in magnesium. So having food sources like green leafy vegetables, fish, legumes, whole grains, and looking at all the many ways that we could be reducing our magnesium. I have those listed under risk factors. So looking at our intake, are we losing it just through cooking? And I do think that many people are very low in magnesium, and there can be many effects of that. So there's a way to measure magnesium in the body. And again, that can be done through a health practitioner. So what are the good sources of magnesium? I usually hear, oh, chocolate. Chocolate is really high in magnesium. Well, there are many other foods that are really high in magnesium: pumpkin seeds, chia seeds. Usually you're going to see like nuts, seeds, vegetables, excuse me, whole grains, all tend to be a bit on the high side. But again, when we cook these foods or change them in some way, we may lose some of that magnesium. The other mineral that is important for brain health is that of iron. So for people who have anemia, iron deficiency anemia, or even for a child who is growing, if they have higher demand or maybe they have absorption issues, For women who are menstruating, who may have more blood loss, and so then they're not replenishing, it is important to have enough iron for a healthy brain. So many people are concerned about too much iron, but we do need to look at the other side of what happens when you don't have enough and what happens to brain health. It's, there's a dynamic with many of the nutrients that we're talking about. Nutrition is a relationship science. So what we see with iron is that it works very well with vitamin C. And so one other way to be getting iron is even through cookware, the types of iron type of cookware, or even making sure that we take certain supplements separate from each other so that they don't compete for absorption. So many different ways to get iron into the body. This is just a nutrition physical exam, just one small thing to look at as far as, we can be looking at our skin, our hair, our eyes, our nails. This is why I often say, don't paint your nails, because you can see so much in the way of ridges and lines and indentations and specks. So for iron deficiency, what you can see with respect to changes in the nail would be a spoon-shaped nail. You see this kind of dip that may indicate iron deficiency. Sometimes with the nails, it can also be a protein deficiency or other minerals like zinc. So it's not always the case that it's just one thing. You have to look overall. So here are some food sources of iron. And so you can see here a number of different things. And what is interesting here is that sometimes in these food sources, there are things that block or reduce its uptake. So again, how we cook food, it's really important. In fact, I'm going to be giving a talk on anti-nutrients in February, talking about oxalates, lectins, tannins, phytates, some of these things that do block the uptake of things like minerals, like iron specifically. All right, selenium is another important mineral for the brain. It's a potent antioxidant. It plays a role in the replenishment of glutathione in the body, helps with the production of thyroid hormone, helps with the immune system function. It's found, my favorite source of selenium is Brazil nuts, but you can find it in a variety of different foods. But if we don't have enough, it can lead to changes in mood, changes in muscle. And so again, it's important to be evaluated for these different nutrients to see where you net out. So here again, food sources, Brazil nuts, look at how high this is, 544 micrograms per serving. So 6 to 8 nuts. And so just even having 1 to 2 nuts on a regular basis could provide a pretty significant amount of selenium. All right, then phytonutrients. Save the best for last. No, not really. They're all important, but I do like phytonutrients. The carotenoids I mentioned I would come back to. Then there are the flavonoids. Carotenoids are something that I studied in graduate school. This was the topic of my master's degree. So I spent 3 years focusing in on, beta carotene, lutein, zeaxanthin, beta cryptozanthin. There are 700 carotenoids in nature. This is what gives plants their color, their beauty. So for some of you, you're in the Northern Hemisphere, and so it's, the leaves are changing. We start to see that chlorophyll breaks down, and you see the carotenoids that are underneath. So certain carotenoids like lutein and zeaxanthin can actually cross the blood-brain barrier. Why? Because they're lipophilic. They're very fatty. So they can come into the brain and they can even lodge within the brain. And in fact, lutein can cross all the cortices and the brain membranes. And if we look at just even assessing the concentrations in blood of other carotenoids, ones like beta carotene, I mentioned beta cryptozanthin. You may not have heard a lot about that one. Usually when people think carotenoid, they think carotene, they think beta carotene, but there are so many different carotenoids floating around in our blood. We've got about 40 of them out of the 700, but we don't have very good clinical laboratory assessments in order to give us even the smaller amounts of some of the other like less prevalent ones. So in general, there are some of these main ones that get focused on in research studies, and it seems that some of these, as listed here, can be predictive of brain carotenoid concentration. So measuring the blood levels seem to coincide with brain levels. So brain and blood, there can be that correlation for certain of these carotenoids. So even though you can't measure the brain, you can measure the blood and then get a sense of what might be in the brain. So there's more and more data, and I watch the data pretty closely on carotenoids, and there's more data to suggest that carotenoids may positively impact cognition. And it's thought that the way that they work, it's hard to say because, I do think that some of these compounds have mechanisms that we don't fully understand, but just from the nature of how they are and how we know them to be, it's thought that they have antioxidant, anti-inflammatory effects, but they may also have a structural effect as well in the brain because, they kind of look like fatty acids. So that's why they kind of go together with those omega-3s. They kind of look like fatty acids. So they may have a structural take in the brain. So this is just more of the same, really talking about the role of carotenoids in brain health, looking at how, now this was a meta-analysis where they had many different clinical trials together, and they show that there was a positive effect of carotenoid supplementation on cognitive performance in healthy people. It's really difficult sometimes to optimize cognition in people who are healthy. It's really hard to show that from a research perspective. So to actually demonstrate that is a big deal. So lutein and zeaxanthin were most frequently tested. The dose and the source of carotenoids were relatively inconsistent. So it's hard to just say like, okay, you need 6 milligrams of lutein for this, or you need 1 milligram of zeaxanthin. So we can't give that kind of specificity in, as far as a recommendation, but I do think just having more plant-based foods with those colors can help to ensure that we have the variety of carotenoids in order to help with brain health. This is another one. And again, this is more of an association, right? So this is looking at almost 3,000 middle-aged adults. They gave them different cognitive tests, and they found that carotenoids in the diet were found to be associated with a higher cognitive score. So again, there's an association. It's not causal. It's not saying that it's carotenoids by themselves, but carotenoids are a piece of the whole. And by way of talking about brain health and carotenoids, I just want to insert here a little bit about the eyes, because the way I see the eyes is that they're connected to the brain, right? We have the optic nerve, and it's a very nerve-rich, it's constantly changing. It's very much in flux, and there is a concentration of carotenoids in the eye. And I just think that this is so neat. I wanted to share this with you. I did a whole presentation on carotenoids and really delved deep into eye health and actually learned a lot. There's a lot of recent science on this. And I think it comes from the fact that many of us are on screens a lot. Look at us right now, right? We're exposed to this bright screen, a lot of artificial light at night. Well, what do? Well, sure, we can put on blue light blocking glasses. We can temper our use of technology. But one of the things that we can be doing is to ensure that we have a good foundation of carotenoids in the eye, because these specific carotenoids, like the ones that are listed here, specifically lutein and zeaxanthin, they can protect and absorb a lot of that artificial light. And we do see, and it's been shown for many years, that having higher amounts of these carotenoids helps to reduce the risk of age-related macular degeneration. But I'm talking about something different now. I'm just talking about exposure to blue light. So I do have this, and if you look at the bottom, this study, or this, it was more of a review looking at lutein and eye diseases. It was published in 2020. Lutein seems to be one of the best protectors against the effects of blue light. And sources of the blue light, as I've been mentioning, is technology, right? We're on our phones, we're on computers, tablets, iPads. The lighting in our homes is, just being bombarded with this this exposure of this blue light. And you probably know about melatonin, and then we get changes in melatonin production. Melatonin is produced by the pineal gland in darkness. And when we have all this artificial light, we start to change melatonin, which is going to change sleep, and that changes brain health. You see again how it's all connected. So pretty powerful to see that lutein can absorb a significant percentage of blue light. So another reason to be getting in those plants. So where do you find it? Where do you find lutein and zeaxanthin? I kind of see them as brother and sister, lutein and zeaxanthin. Because if you look in the eye, and I'm not showing you the slide, they're kind of like molecular blinds. So when there's light exposure on the retina, it's almost like lutein and zeaxanthin, they kind of change their configuration to help with the exposure of that light to protect the back of the eye. So you kind of need them both. And even like the middle of the macula, the back of the eye, so the middle, the fovea, has a different concentration, very highly regulated, of lutein and zeaxanthin. So you can see here that some of the top sources are going to be greens. I know that these tend to be more yellow, but yellow carotenoids tend to be found in green foods. So we would, it's not obvious, but as you cook them and as you start to look under the surface and get a little bit deeper, those carotenoids come out. So kale, spinach, parsley. I think parsley is the next kale. Parsley is pretty rich in lutein and zeaxanthin, but lots of different, pistachios are pretty rich in lutein. That's why if you notice, they're kind of yellow-green. So that yellow-green is lutein, zeaxanthin. Another good one is avocado. I know it's towards the bottom here, but in general, like that yellow-green color of avocado is connected to lutein and zeaxanthin. And avocado also gives you fiber. It's a good brain food overall. It has folate. So again, I know I'm segueing here into talking about lutein and zeaxanthin and eyes, but I do think it's important for brain health. And I see I'm at the top of the hour, so I'm going to speed this up a little bit. So I just have here ways to get lutein in the diet, and in ways that would give a higher amount, like 10 milligrams here. So I'm bolding the different foods that would contain the lutein and zeaxanthin. So it is possible. Not everybody has to do a supplement. If you're pretty conscientious about your diet, you can bring it in. All right, so the carotenoids. When I think of carotenoids, I think of red, orange, and yellow. So now we shift over to blue purple. And when I think of blue purple, I think of the flavonoids. And most people are falling short on blue purple foods. Now, this is an older survey from 2009, but in general, nature doesn't give us a lot of blue purple foods. So just generally, we're going to fall short. And there are certain times of the year that we're going to have more blue purple than other times of the year. So if you look at this, now I showed you the fatty acid family tree. This is the phytochemical family tree. And if you see up at the top here how it says carotenoids. Well, carotenoids are different from the phenolics all the way to the left. And under phenolics, this is a large category of many different kinds of compounds. And the ones for the brain, actually all of them are very brain health friendly. And as we dive into purple, and I often say like blue purple is for the brain, we're going to be talking about these right here, the anthocyanidins and the proanthocyanidins. So some of you know me because I've talked a lot about the rainbow of foods and what it's good for. The entire color spectrum is important for the brain. There is a little bit more specificity, however, when we start getting into blue purple. So I don't want to negate and say like, oh, you just focus on blue purple and your brain is fine. I do think that all of the colors, just like I talked about with the carotenoids, it's all important. And speaking to the colors and the spectrum and the variety, what we see here is that aiming for diversity it's very important for brain health. And in fact, greater variety has been shown to be associated with a higher mini mental state exam score. So this is a measure of cognitive performance. It's just a very basic functional test. cognitive domains such as executive function, memory, and attention in adults, just having more diversity. So even just starting there, children with less dietary diversity and dietary adequacy have greater anxiety, and women with lower dietary diversity had greater associations with anxiety and depression. So again, the takeaway is get the rainbow, get variety. And my approach to, just to circle back to the gut for a second, because it ties into our blue-purple category. I've been talking about this 3P approach to gut health for a couple of years now. So talking about prebiotic fibers, which I've already talked about, those fibers that change the milieu of the gut, the probiotics, the different microorganisms which we can get from food. But then there is this separate class of polyphenols, which really speaks to that phenolic category, and then underneath all of those different subcategories. Well, where do we find polyphenols? We find them in these blue-purple foods, the berries and grapes, the tea, the cocoa, some of the brown foods, spices and herbs. And polyphenols are seeming to interact, I would say, I don't know if it's additively or synergistically, but they do have a very distinct effect in the gut that can translate to a system-wide effect. So to me, I don't just see prebiotics and probiotics for gut and then we're done. It really is about bringing in those polyphenols. And the blue-purple foods are polyphenol rich. And if we look at one of the categories of flavonoids, the flavonoids seem to have a mood impact because they bind certain receptors that would also be intended for other neurotransmitters. So they're kind of like, how phytoestrogens would bind to certain hormone receptors. Well, these flavonoids bind to certain neurohormone receptors. So that's kind of interesting. Blueberries and grapes have been most well studied. And what we see, and this is just a composite of all of the literature out there, is that essentially these compounds lodge into certain parts of the brain that are responsible for learning, memory, and mood. So I did break out some of those compounds if you're interested in them. I'm not going to get into all the names, but just covering our bases by having more blue-purple foods, we get that array. They and I would say, really important to be looking at how much blue-purple you are getting in the diet. We can get it through many different food sources depending on the time of year. I know if I was stranded on a desert island, probably even more than the blueberries, I would take blackberries because they're higher in fiber. They have a deeper hue. I mean, blackberries are so concentrated in these pigments. They just haven't been as well studied as blueberries. We just happen to have more studies on blueberries. But I have a hunch based on the composition of blackberries that they would be probably even better in some ways. Boysenberries, figs, huckleberries, plums, prunes, purple grapes, raisins. I was just at the store and I had the opportunity to buy green grapes, red grapes, or purple grapes. And of course, I'm going to take the purple, especially when I see that they're organic, they're in season. Purple at this time of year in the autumn is really important for kind of the seasonal signaling of brain activity. So choose purple whenever you can. That's really the takeaway. And I have here just some ideas, which I've already toured you through a bit. If you see at the store purple potato, in fact, this morning I had purple potatoes as part of my breakfast. If we can choose purple, we should take it. It doesn't always come to us in the store. So whenever you see a purple variety of a food that normally is maybe green, or I was also at the store and I saw purple cauliflower was in season or at least available. So I'm going to choose the purple over the white for sure. All right. So berries in general, so many different studies on berry fruits being involved in brain signaling, helping with many different, back to the mechanisms that I opened up this webinar with, inflammation, cell survival, neuroplasticity, neurotransmission. And for people that have more berries in the diet, what we see in the research, and even a very large study, the Nurses Health Study, in which they had over 16,000 participants, is that having more blueberries and strawberries was associated with delays in cognitive aging. And again, it's just the concentration of these different compounds. Blueberries are great, especially for those of us who live in the Pacific Northwest. They have a lot of different compounds. I'm just focusing on flavonoids, but they have a number of different things. And I like the small, wild, very, the deeper the hue and the smaller they are, that's what I aim for, because I don't really need much of the inside because that's the sugary component. I want the skin. We're after the skin because that's where all those phytochemicals are hanging out. So blueberries, if I just take the sum of the research, and again, there's a lot on the studies for blueberries. So looking at inflammation, promoting healthy blood sugar, reducing glycation, helping with DNA damage, even beyond what you see here, there's a lot. And here is kind of breaking it out again with a number of the different studies. I remember I gave a whole 1-hour talk just on blue-purple foods in the brain, right? There's just so much data. Dr. James Joseph at Tufts University has done a lot, especially in animal models, showing better memory, better learning with things like blueberries, right? And we even see in clinical work, so studies with people, an improvement in cognition, in older adults and in kids. Why don't we have blueberries at school? And improve positive affect and mood also in children and young adults. So there you go. Purple carrots, one of my favorites. They're beautiful. Purple cauliflower. It looks like a brain, doesn't it? And we want purple brains. This is my sacred geometry Brussels sprout, which I just love this because, I mean, it's green, but then on the inside, you also get the benefit of the purple. Now, the only thing about these purple compounds is that they're water soluble. So with cooking, with extended cooking, you're going to find that you're going to leach them out. Not ideal because then you lose some of that. So you just have to modify the amount of cooking. So yes, I talked about flavonoids, that's part of the whole blue purple, just indicating to you here that having more flavonoids is associated with a lower risk of dementia, a number of studies on that. So in terms of the flavonoid foods, they're the polyphenol foods. It's the berries, it's the blue purple, it's some of the greens, and it's also, for those of you who do like cocoa, like I do, and cacao, cocoa and cacao are high flavonoid foods. So there are some studies, and I know that this will be good news for you to take away, that there is some improvement of having cocoa and helping brain health, opening up the blood vessels, improving brain oxygen. There was another study showing that it improved cognitive health in postmenopausal women at 10 grams on a daily basis. Who doesn't want to hear that? Now, we're not talking about the sugar-laden chocolate. We're talking about the bitter cocoa, right? And in terms of like a chocolate bar, I always aim for, right now, I'm like at an 85 to 90% cocoa. I try to get it as high as possible where it's still palatable. Dark chocolate intake is associated with the release of nerve growth factors. There are some neat studies where they take white chocolate, which essentially has no cocoa, it's just a bunch of sugar, versus dark chocolate. And then they look at brain health markers just over like a very short time frame, like 28 days. And you can definitely see the impact that dark chocolate can have a favorable impact on brain health markers. Green tea is another one that's rich in flavonoids, contains brain available antioxidant polyphenols, these catechins, which are very specific to green tea, a beneficial role in memory and learning. And it can also help with promoting brain waves that cultivate more relaxation and attentiveness at the same time. So this is just showing that epigallocatechin gallate, which is one of the main catechins in green tea, was one of the most neuroprotective compounds in green tea. So look at this. You can see the neurite length, and you can see how EGCG was promoting the health of that neuron. So we're almost done here. I just want to close with spices. So turmeric, curcumin, brain health, more spices, better, diversity of spices. In fact, turmeric can cross the blood-brain barrier. Turmeric is very, and curcuminoids, I probably should be more specific. They're lipid soluble, so they can get into the brain. They can help to mobilize brain amyloid. And again, back to the omega-3. So my perfect combo here is to take the omega-3s, carotenoids, and turmeric, because that's a blend of things that are all fatty and all go sink right into fat, which would be the brain, and all very protective. So some ideas for spices, I'm sure that you can come up with this. Rotate your spices, clean out your spice rack, give yourself the gift of that activity over the holidays, because some people just don't pay attention to their spices. They get caked and crusty and they're past their expiration date. Just give yourself an hour on a Saturday just to go through your spice rack, clean it up, get it ready, get rid of those plastic containers of spices. You don't want the infiltration of those plastics into your spices. I mean, these are very concentrated amounts of phytonutrients, so you don't want to adulterate that. All right, and I just have some general ideas for how to get more spice in food. I try to incorporate spices into just about everything. I was just in the Mediterranean area, and it was nice to see their spices, what they have over there versus, it just, more the oregano, the dill, the fennel. I was surprised at how much fennel I saw in Cyprus. So it just kind of, when we can move over to different spices, we just create different flavor profiles, different phytochemical profiles. We create that diversity. We can change the gut microbiome with spices. Some of them do stimulate a better mucin layer even. All right, so I have gone way over our time, and I told Elizabeth I need to end it on time, and here I am. So thank you to those of you who have stuck around. And I welcome any questions that you want to toss on the thread of where Elizabeth will be posting this. She's going to put it on the Marlene's page, the Tacoma, and the Federal Way page. This is a summary of what I talked about tonight. So when it comes to brain health, first and foremost, look at the root causes. You have to almost think like a scientist when you think about health. Like, why would things go awry in the brain? Well, there's inflammation, there's oxidative stress, the gut microbiome is not in good, healthy working order, and maybe there aren't enough nutrients. So how do we repair those mechanisms? Well, let's get the macronutrient base, get those essential fats. Let's get the protein for healthy neurotransmitters and healthy insulin sensitivity. Let's have complex carbohydrates, especially those fibers, to give us the short chain fatty acids. Let's get the whole array of vitamins and minerals that we need, as well as those plant-based compounds. Excuse me. So this is kind of how I eat breakfast. This is a breakfast that I had, and I would say that this is encompassing a lot of the different features of what I talked about for the brain. We've got blue purple, I have blackberries here. This was more in the summertime, so you can see a variety of things. So eat the rainbow for your inner rainbow, especially that beautiful brain that you have. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Dr. Minich. It's always an honor to work with you. You're so inspiring, and I always get so excited about all the vegetables that are in my fridge after you talk. So I'm like, oh, I can
Yay!
make this, I can make that.
That's the point, right? We need that inspiration to fuel motivation. So that's good.
Well, thank you so much for all that you do in the community and for your time tonight. And thank you everyone who tuned in. Super
Yes.
appreciate you. And this will be also on the YouTube channel, and I put that link in the chat box. And if you have any questions, go to either one of the Tacoma Facebook page or the Federal Way Facebook page. And we thank you.
Thank you all.